Welcome to this deep dive. We're here to unpack some complex topics using some really interesting sources to get to the core insights.
That's right.
And today we're looking into the history of Fuller Theological Seminary's School of Intercultural Studies. Now, you might know it as SIS, but it actually started out as the School of World Mission, the SWM.
And that original name, SWM, it really means something in missiology circles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So our goal today is to figure out why this one school became so influential, especially for American evangelicals, and how they thought about, global missions, particularly reaching areas that hadn't been reached before.
Yeah, and the timing is really key here. You have to think about the post-World War II era. There was this massive explosion of new global ministries being founded.
Like way more than before.
Oh, absolutely. Get this. Between 1945 and 1976, 426 new organizations popped up. Compare that to just 113 in the 45 years before 1945.
Wow, it's a huge jump.
It really is. And it wasn't just, post-war energy. It reflected deeper shifts happening within evangelicalism, different ways of thinking about the Great Commission, this growing sense of a connected world.
Okay, so let's go back to the very beginning. Charles E. Fuller, the guy the seminary is named after, he was a huge deal in the 1940s, right? Those radio shows.
The Pilgrim Hour, the old-fashioned revival hour, immensely popular. We're talking massive audiences.
So given he was this big evangelist, his first idea for a seminary out on the West Coast was very practical.
Exactly. He wanted to train evangelists and missionaries, give them, actual tools they could use in the field. Very focused.
Right. And then later on, you have Ralph D. Winter, and we'll definitely talk more about him. He saw the founding of the School of World Mission in '65 as sort of a return to that original vision.
Yeah, he called it a mid-course correction. Like they were refocusing back on Charles Fuller's original passion for evangelism and missions.
Makes sense. And Charles's son, Dan Fuller, he kind of laid out why they needed this specific school. He saw Christians trying to plant churches all over the world facing these really complex problems.
Problems that needed serious study.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the idea was, let's create a hub, a place to research these challenges and then, crucially, get those findings out there, not just to students, but, to everyone involved.
And you have to remember, back in the 1960s, this was a pretty radical idea. A whole graduate school, an evangelical one, just focused on world mission. That wasn't really a thing in the West.
Seminaries might have had, one professor who knew about missions?
Maybe. Often just someone with experience in, say, India or Africa, but not a whole dedicated program like this. It was quite unique.
Okay, so enter Donald A. McGavran, the founding dean. And his whole life, apparently, was driven by this quest.
This one long search for effective evangelism, as one biographer put it. And he wasn't just an academic. He had this incredibly rich background, grew up in India, missionary parents, grandparents, real deep roots in the field.
And he had this kind of conversion moment himself, didn't he, to this idea of church growth?
He did. It happened when he saw these mass movements to Christ happening in India, huge groups of people turning to Christianity. And he was really upfront about who influenced him.
Right, Bishop Pickett.
Methodist Bishop Jarrell Wascom Pickett. McGavran said, Pickett lit my candle, basically sparked his interest in church growth way back in the 30s.
So he worked with Pickett for like 2 decades.
Yeah, studying these movements, checking if they were genuine, figuring out why they were happening. All that research led to his big book, Bridges of God.
And that book really spread his ideas beyond just India, right?
Definitely. And central to it all was his definition of mission. Pretty straightforward. An enterprise devoted to proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ and persuading men to become his disciples and dependable members of his church.
Proclaiming and persuading to become dependable members.
Okay. Yeah, and that ties into the core idea of bridges of God. He noticed people were much more likely to become Christians if they did it with people like them, people from their own culture.
So less about one person converting alone and more about groups.
Exactly. People movements, he called them. Think whole families, villages, social groups moving towards Christianity together. The individual decision might come, within that group context, often building on existing relationships.
And that led him to this other big concept, the Homogeneous Unit Principle, HUP.
That's the one. He saw these people movements or Christward movements happening most often within what he called homogeneous units.
Which just means?
It's basically a section of society in which all members have some characteristics in common. Shared language, culture, background, that kind of thing.
Okay, so after all these years in India, founding his own Institute of Church Growth, he gets the call from Fuller. He's 65 by then.
Right. And he takes the job as founding dean of the SWM, really, because he wanted a platform, a way to pass on everything he'd learned to the next generation of missionaries.
And we actually know what their early priorities were, thanks to a letter someone found.
Yeah, a letter from F. Carlton Booth. It spelled it out. Church planting was huge. Faculty needed real field experience, not just theory. They wanted visiting lecturers and, crucially, advanced training for missionaries when they came back home on furlough.
Very practical focus again. But this church growth movement, it wasn't without its critics, was it?
Oh, definitely not. A major criticism was that it focused too much on just numbers, on getting people in the door, maybe without enough emphasis on, deep discipleship or spiritual growth.
And the idea that maybe any method was okay as long as it worked to boost numbers.
That concern was definitely voiced, especially as these ideas got picked up in places like North America and Korea, where church growth became really big.
But Ralph Winter, he pushed back on that, right? He argued it wasn't just about counting heads.
He did. Winter insisted that, the whole point of church growth included integrating new believers into the church community. It wasn't just about individual decisions. It was about the quality of the church's life together. Christianity isn't just a solo thing, he'd argue.
Okay. And that homogeneous unit principle, the HUP, that really stirred things up.
That was probably the most controversial part. Some people flat out called it racist or discriminatory.
Which is a serious charge.
Absolutely. And look, it's true that some people unfortunately did misuse the HUP to justify keeping churches segregated or resisting integration. That definitely happened.
But the principle itself wasn't intended that way.
McGavran's defenders, and Winter too, would argue no. They'd say the misinterpretations often came from wanting instant, perfectly integrated churches, which sometimes ignored the reality that new believers often feel more comfortable, initially at least, with people from their own background.
It's like that bridges of God idea again. People from a group who become Christians can then be the bridge to their own people.
Precisely. McGavran was already talking in that book about reaching people on the edges, not just through generic evangelism. He saw these cultural connections as vital.
So what he was really doing was trying to figure out how to push the church into places it hadn't gone before and how these group movements worked.
Yeah, it was pretty groundbreaking stuff for its time. And being dean at Fuller's SWM gave him a huge platform to push these ideas forward.
What was the initial plan for the school itself? Like faculty and students?
The vision was actually for a pretty small core faculty. The student body was expected to be mostly missionaries already on furlough or candidates heading out, plus some graduate fellows from the younger churches, Asia, Africa, Latin America, to help build up the research side.
And Fuller's own description, their bulletin, laid out the goals.
Yep. They listed things like preparing leaders for a changing world, giving all pastors a theology of missions, fostering exchange with Christians from other countries, and building this dedicated research center.
And McGavran wasn't alone. He had some other heavy hitters on the faculty.
Oh, absolutely. Alan Tippett was key. He brought a strong anthropological perspective, really rigorous scholarship. And then there was Ralph Winter,
who we mentioned. His focus was church history.
Well, he preferred to call it the expansion of Christianity, kind of building on Kenneth Scott Latourrette's work. Winter was also a huge champion for McGavran's church growth ideas and for something called theological education by extension, basically finding ways to train pastors and church leaders right where they lived and ministered, outside the traditional seminary walls, a very practical approach.
And the atmosphere at the SWM back then sounds pretty unique. Not your typical grad school.
Not at all. Very informal. The students, they often called them associates, were nearly all experienced missionaries.
So they brought a ton of real-world knowledge.
Exactly. Winter used to joke they might only have a few full-time students, but they had 100 teachers because the faculty learned so much from the missionaries sharing their experiences in open discussions. It was a two-way street.
Winter seems like a real engine behind a lot of things there. Like the William Carey Library.
Yeah, that was huge. He saw all this amazing research coming out of the SWM from these experienced missionaries. Valuable stuff, but maybe not big enough for a major publisher.
So he started the library to get it out there.
Right. Publish important, maybe niche missiological work affordably so people actually doing missions could access it. Very strategic.
And he also pushed for different kinds of degrees, didn't he?
He did. He realized that degrees like a doctor of ministry, or even the doctor of missiology they initially offered, weren't always recognized internationally.
Could cause problems getting visas or teaching jobs overseas.
Exactly. So he advocated for Fuller to offer MA and PhD degrees in missiology, which were, more standard and understood worldwide. That was a big step for establishing missiology as a serious academic field.
And another big initiative that came out of SWM was the American Society of Missiology, the ASM.
Yes, and its journal, Missiology. That was largely Winter again, working with George Peters from Dallas Seminary. Their vision was ambitious.
How so?
They wanted a professional society that wasn't just for evangelicals. They aimed to bring together scholars and practitioners from evangelical, ecumenical, and Roman Catholic backgrounds, plus mission agency leaders, anthropologists, linguists. Really broad.
That sounds pretty inclusive for the time.
It really was. And the journal Missiology grew out of that. They basically took over an existing journal called Practical Anthropology, broadened its scope, and Winter helped manage it initially.
Sure.
It quickly became the major academic journal in the field.
And lots of Fuller faculty involved.
Oh, yeah. Many served as editors over the years. It kept that strong connection between the school and the leading edge of missiological thinking.
Now, over time, Winter's focus started to shift more and more towards what he called the unreached.
Exactly. The unreached areas of the world. He noticed that even within the SWM faculty, there were huge parts of the world they just didn't have much information about, which suggested to him...
No missionaries there.
Pretty much. He famously said something like, he could graduate 1,000 more missionaries, and still maybe not one would go to a place where no one had gone before. That really bothered him.
And that concern fed directly into the Lausanne Congress in 1974.
It absolutely did. Lausanne was a massive global gathering on world evangelization. Winter got the SWM faculty and students working, compiling data, making charts.
Charts showing what?
Showing the parts of the world, the specific people groups where there was little or no Christian witness. The goal was to basically confront the global church with this data and challenge them to finish the task.
And Lausanne had some big goals itself, right?
4 main ones. Create a biblical statement on evangelism, challenge the church to complete world evangelization, that was Winter's big push, figure out the link between evangelism and social action, and build fellowship among evangelicals.
And both McGavran and Winter presented there.
They did powerful presentations. They talked about the sheer number of unevangelized people, like 2.7 billion back then. They pushed this idea of thinking in terms of people groups.
Not just countries.
Right, distinct cultural and linguistic groups within countries. They also talked about E1, E2, E3 evangelism.
Can you quickly break that down?
Sure. E1 is basically reaching people in your own culture. E2 is reaching people in a culture similar to yours. And E3 is reaching people in a very different culture, crossing significant barriers.
Okay. And they emphasize the role of newer churches.
Yeah, the potential of churches in Africa, Asia, Latin America to become major forces in mission themselves.
Winter also made a distinction there between mission and evangelism, didn't he?
He did. For him, evangelism could happen anywhere, even reaching your own neighbors. But mission specifically meant cross-cultural evangelism, crossing those linguistic, cultural, maybe racial boundaries. That was key for him.
Interesting. And apparently, one of the students back at Fuller picked up on a crucial point from Winter's Lausanne talk.
Yeah, a student named Bruce Graham. He pointed out that Winter wasn't just saying find the unreached. He was also saying we need totally new ways of doing evangelism to even connect with these culturally distant groups. The old methods might not work.
That makes sense. You can't just walk in and expect people to understand.
Right. Winter himself talked about a kind of people blindness, this tendency we have to not really see or understand people who are very different from us. We see the differences as problems
Instead of
maybe opportunities or just realities to be understood. He felt the Bible itself was much more attuned to people groups than we often are.
So, with this intense focus on unreached peoples, Winter started thinking beyond just the seminary, right? He wanted something more action-oriented.
Exactly. He felt the academic setting of the SWM, while valuable, wasn't set up for the kind of direct collaboration with mission agencies he envisioned. He looked at coordinating bodies like the ones at 475 Riverside Drive in New York as a kind of model.
There was even talk of a Fuller Annex, like a separate but connected organization.
Yeah, something more flexible, more activist, that could actually try out and implement these new strategies for reaching unreached groups.
But in the end, he decided to go his own way.
He and his wife, Roberta, felt called to pursue this vision independently. So in 1976, they founded the U.S. Center for World Mission, the USCWM.
with McGavran's blessing, apparently.
Yes, McGavran actually encouraged him. He seemed to recognize that Winter's specific passion for these frontier missions needed its own dedicated vehicle.
And the USCWM really took off, focusing on those frontier missions.
Absolutely. Researching unreached peoples, cataloging them, mobilizing prayer and resources, training people through massive programs like the Perspectives
And
course.
publishing, too, right? Through William Carey Library, which moved with them, and things like Mission Frontiers magazine.
Yeah, it became this huge hub for the whole frontier missions movement, and it really stands as, a major legacy flowing out of that original Fuller School of World Mission.
So, wrapping up our deep dive here,
Mhm.
what's the big picture? The Fuller School of World Mission starts with this practical vision from Charles Fuller.
Evolves into this powerhouse of missiological thinking, really shaped by Donald McGavran's church growth ideas and Alan Tippett's anthropology.
And then you have Ralph Winter pushing relentlessly towards those unreached people groups, spinning off major organizations and influencing mission strategy globally.
It really became a pivotal place, and the concepts they wrestled with back then are still incredibly relevant today.
Yeah, things like understanding culture and evangelism,
Mm.
focusing on groups still waiting to hear the Christian message. These ideas haven't gone away.
Not at all. They continue to shape how missions are planned and carried out right now in the 21st century.
Which brings us to a final thought for you listening in. We've talked a lot about reaching different people groups, focusing on the unreached globally. What does that mean for us right here? How do we think about and engage with the diversity in our own communities, in the world right around us?
Yeah, what kind of bridges, maybe, need to be built in our own context? Something to definitely reflect on as we finish up.